Hi guys. Today we'll be covering session 3 of the sales and BD interview process. Today we'll be talking about answering some sales and BD specific questions.
तो अब हम लोग स्टार्ट करने वाले हैं सेल्स एंड बीडी इंटरव्यू सेशन 3 आंसरिंग सेल्स एंड बीडी क्वेश्चन। तो आगे चलते हैं।
How exactly to answer these questions and how to relate with them and engage with them. We'll talk about some general questions as well, but again, as usual,
वहाँ पर क्या क्या क्वेश्चन आ सकता है और उसे कैसे डील करेंगे, इस सब के बारे में जानेंगे।
the focus here is primarily on sales and business development oriented interview processes. And while this can help in a general extent, and you will be able to take a lot of this information elsewhere, there will be some specific points which will be relevant, particularly for sales and business development. So our agenda for today is to talk about several of the common question types that will be asked.
कुछ ऐसे क्वेश्चन हैं जो कि फ्रिक्वेंटली आस्क्ड हैं, उस सब के बारे में बात करेंगे। यहाँ पर कुछ इसका एजेंडा में देख सकते हैं। कुछ ऐसे क्वेश्चन दिए गए हैं। स्ट्रेंथ, वीकनेस, ग्रोथ, मोटिवेशन, आर यू कंफर्टेबल विद, सेल मी दिस, टेल मी अबाउट, हाउ वुड यू हैंडल, व्हाई डिड यू लीव योर करंट प्रीवियस एम्प्लॉयर। ये सब क्वेश्चन के बारे में डिस्कस करेंगे और आगे इससे डीप रिवीजन करेंगे।
Asked and offered. First, we'll be talking about what is your greatest strength, what is your greatest weakness. We'll be talking about how to idealize towards getting an answer that pushes who you are to the employer in an extent that they understand that you will be a good fit for the role. Next, we'll talk about goals and motivations. What is it that inspires you and motivates you and pushes you forward? After that, we're going to talk a little bit about several of the specific kind of questions that you will get. First of all, there's a discussion of what you're comfortable with, whether you're okay with working on weekends or different hours, or whether you're comfortable with other certain stipulations or requirements of the company, how to respond to these. Next, we'll be talking about the sell me this question, absolute staple of sales.
तो सबसे पहले स्ट्रेंथ और वीकनेस क्या क्या है वो सब के बारे में डिस्कस होगा। गोल्स और मोटिवेशन, ये दोनों को पूछ सकता है जिसलिए आपको क्या स्ट्रेंथ है, क्या वीकनेस है आपकी, और उस सबको क्लियर करना है। फिर उसके बाद इंटरव्यू में जाए। फिर गोल्स और मोटिवेशन, आपका क्या गोल्स है, आप क्या करने का रखते हैं, आपका क्या मोटिवेशन है, क्यों आप इस कंपनी को ज्वाइन करना चाहते हैं। इस टाइप का क्वेश्चन पूछा जा सकता है। आर यू कंफर्टेबल विद, तो कोई भी आपको कंफर्टेबल वाला क्वेश्चन पूछ सकते हैं कि आप कंफर्टेबल हो इस जॉब के लिए, आपको आप ये जॉब क्यों हायर कर रहे हो और मैं आपको ये जॉब क्यों दूँ, ये सब के बारे में। सेल में दिस, और कोई प्रोडक्ट बोलेगा और इसको सेल करने बोलेगा और इसके बारे में कोई टॉपिक दे देगा और इसके बारे में पूछने के लिए बताएगा कि इसके बारे में क्या क्या जानते हो आप बताओ। हाउ वुड यू हैंडल, आप कुछ ऐसा कंडीशन दे देगा और उसको बताएगा कि अगर आप इस कंडीशन को कैसे हैंडल करोगे उसके बारे में। और फिर ये भी पूछ सकता है कि आपने पहले कहीं पर जॉब किया था या नहीं किया था, अगर किया था तो क्यों छोड़ दिया। और आगे बहुत से क्वेश्चन आपके जर्नी से पूछे जाएगा, आपने अभी तक में क्या क्या किया।
Sales interviews, this will require you to sell either a simple basic object, the most common one being sell me this pen, or alternatively, it will be talking about trying to get you to sell the company's product itself and push it forward in that way. Next, we have the tell me about question. So they could say something along the lines of, tell me about a situation where you struggled with a colleague, or tell me about a situation in which a customer or client had a difficult relationship with you and how were you able to resolve it. These kinds of questions are essentially asking you for a story, and we'll talk a little bit about those when we come to it. Next, we have the how would you handle question. Usually they give you hypothetical scenarios or problems and ask you how you would take care of that situation. These are generally fairly subjective, but they're also trying to think through your problem-solving lens and trying to help understand how exactly you would solve issues and problems if you were not given direct direction. And lastly, we'll talk about what to answer when discussing things like why or how you left your last or previous employer. So let's begin with strengths and weaknesses. So, what should we understand about this? What do we want to keep in mind first? Well, first things first, you don't ever want to simply let a weakness sit idle. What I mean by that is that when you discuss a weakness and when you discuss something that you might have had a problem with, you always want to talk about either, number one, whether that weakness might actually be a strength in disguise, or alternatively, the kind of efforts that you've put into overcoming that weakness and growing beyond it to the point where you've taken feedback and then you've actually grown to the point where the weakness might not be as strong as it used to be. And that allows you to move towards the kind of progress of eliminating it entirely. So the company wants to know that you have been putting effort into improving yourself, particularly in trying to remove your weaknesses. Next, when discussing your strengths, be humble, but also be confident. Remember the calm excitement, or the excited calm system that we used during session 2. That needs to be utilized here. Always make sure to utilize that kind of mentality of being able to be proud and joyful and talk.
Things to keep in mind, जो भी माइंड में सोचे स्ट्रेंथ एंड वीकनेस के बारे में, नेवर लेट अ वीकनेस सिट आइडिया. Discuss what efforts you have already put into overcoming your नेवर लेट वीकनेस साइट आइडिया. कोई भी जो वीकनेस होता है वो आपका कमजोरी नहीं है, उस पर काम करें और उसको तो ये आप देखें कि डिस्कस व्हाट एफर्ट्स यू हैव ऑलरेडी पुट इनटू ओवरकमिंग योर वीकनेस. आपने अपने वीकनेस को दूर करने के लिए क्या क्या एफर्ट्स किए और कैसे आप दूर होगा उसके आगे काम करें कि ताकि आपका वीकनेस ख़त्म हो जाए. वे डिस्कसिंग स्ट्रेंथ, जब वो हम स्ट्रेंथ के बारे में डिस्कस कर रहे हैं, बी हम्बल बट कॉन्फिडेंट. तो आपको कॉन्फिडेंट रखना है और हम्बल भी रहना है और मन मुस्काना है और ज़्यादा जो ओवर एक्साइटेड नहीं होना है और पॉजिटिव एटीट्यूड के साथ आंसर भी देना. हाँ, और डिस्कस करना है जो इरेलीवेंट स्ट्रेंथ और टैलेंट के बारे में बात करना है और थोड़ा थोड़ा एक्सप्लेन भी करते जाना है. और ब्रीफली एक्सप्लेन करते हैं तो और अच्छा लगेगा.
Talking very positively about the wonderful strengths that you have and being able to show that they are really something that you take pride in as a person, but at the same time show the kind of level of laid back professionalism to be humble and warm about it. Next, you can discuss job irrelevant strengths or talents, but try to keep them to a minimum and try to only mention them briefly if they do come up. These means things like skills that you have that might not necessarily contribute to the skill at hand. Now, if they can be related, that is something that you can definitely milk out in terms of what that relationship is. For example, you can talk about the fact that your familiarity with marketing as a salesperson does allow you to have a deeper understanding of the concept of what leads are and how you can utilize leads from different sources in different ways to make a more effective sale. That kind of knowledge, despite being off topic, is not irrelevant. It is still a relevant point as long as you can give it relevance. However, there are definitely going to be certain skills that you may personally take advantage of or take pride in, but that wouldn't necessarily be a huge part of the job that you're applying for right now. For example, a skill in cooking could be something that you could be very proud of and you could talk about in terms of discussing your strengths and the fact that you're a family person and stuff like that. And you may want to briefly mention the fact that being a good cook allows you to have a decent understanding of variety and stuff like that, but there's only a hard limit to how much you can really connect something like that to a business skill or a business goal. So you can mention them, but try to be brief about it. Don't waste too much time on concepts that your interviewer will not be able to connect to the job, because oftentimes what can happen as a result of that is that they may lose interest, and that is definitely something you don't want to achieve. You want to make sure that the entire conversation, that the entire interview that you're having is memorable. That's a very, very big keynote here. You want to make sure that the entire interview is memorable, and you want to do everything that you can in order to make sure that you are a very memorable person and you stick in the interviewer's mind. So let's take a look at some examples here. So we'll be doing a lot of examples during today's session. So let's try to break down some examples that I built for you here and talk about how we can utilize these moving forward. So what is your greatest strength? Let's look at the answer we have here. I have a lot of pride in my self-discipline and organization. I like to plan out my sales cycle and ensure it's followed through. I do extensive market research to ensure I'm ready for any eventuality and ensure that stakeholders are made aware of both what to expect and the situation as it develops. For example, and this is an important one, always make sure that you give some kind of example of your greatest strength. Put it into context. Just talking about it in a general extent is not going to give you everything. So for example, in my previous company, I would create sales projects based on market factors and take ownership for ensuring those targets were met. If you have some statistics to throw in here as well, like numbers, then go ahead, do that. That'll make it even more secure in terms of the validity of your example. However, if you don't, it's often fine to just have a sort of generic overarching example that you can plug in, as long as there is an example to go with. Next, we have our greatest weakness. Now, remember what I said in last session, where with the greatest weakness or anything where you're talking about something negative that you've done or some kind of downside, whether that is pushed by the interviewer himself or whether they're simply asking you what is your greatest weakness, you always want to make sure that you do talk about the weakness in a context of answering and then adding. So, how would we do that? Well, my organizational ability has had the problem of reduced flexibility. So what am I doing here? I'm immediately saying that I'm building off of my strengths here. Remember, I'm a very organized person, but that also has the problem of reduced flexibility. This has caused problems in the past. However, I have taken the initiative to create more redundancies in my plans to ensure that while they are structured, they can remain flexible and open to change if there are any unforeseen changes in the market. So what are we saying here? Well, that while I am a little bit rigid, I have been putting effort, I have been moving towards the direction of not relying so heavily on that rigidity and structure. I've become more flexible and I will continue to become more flexible. I've started to grow in that direction. It is still a weakness, but I've started to grow in that direction and I'm looking to remove that entirely within the near future. So when you talk about weaknesses, you want to talk about them in such a way where they make the employer feel like either they're number one, not a very big deal, or number two, something that's going to disappear soon anyway. Sure that and
I have a lot of pride in my self-discipline and organization. Self-discipline and organization के बेसिस पर हमारे पास जो है मेरे पास बहुत से प्राउड कर सकता हूँ ऐसे कंडीशन है. I like to plan out my sales cycle and ensure it's followed through. अपने आप से जो है को I like to plan और मैं प्लान करता हूँ सेल्स साइकिल में जो भी होते हैं उस सब के लिए सेल्स जो किया जाता है उस सब के लिए मैं प्लान बनाता हूँ और कुछ स्ट्रेटजी अपनाता हूँ. आई हैव टू एक्सटेंसिव मार्केट रिसर्च टू आंसर रेडी फॉर एनी इवेंचुअलिटी. तो मैं किसी मार्केट को मैं रीड करता हूँ, उसके बारे में मैं एक बायोडाटा और क्राइटेरिया सेट कर सकता हूँ जिससे कि मैं पता कर सकता हूँ कि मार्केट अप जाएगा डाउन जाएगा इस टाइप. इंश्योर दैट द स्टॉक होल्डर्स आर मेड अवेयर ऑफ बोथ. तो ये सब इंश्योर कर सकता हूँ कि मैं जो है बोथ एस्पेक्ट ऑफ एंड द सिचुएशन इट डेवलप्स और कैसे स्टॉक होल्डर्स जो होते हैं वो कैसे बेनिफिट होगा या लॉस होगा वो सब के बारे में मैं प्रेडिक्शन कर सकता हूँ. और क्या इसके रिलेटेड सिचुएशन डेवलप्ड हो सकता है, उस सबको कैसे सॉल्व आउट किया जा सकता है मैं देख सकता हूँ। फॉर एग्जांपल कुछ ऐसे एग्जांपल हैं, अगर आप ये एग्जांपल शब्द से के बेसिस पर समझाते हो तो उससे ज़्यादा समझ में आएगा और अच्छे से आपको भी आपका उसमें जब आप इंटरव्यू दे रहे हो तो आपका भी रिस्पॉन्स बहुत ज़्यादा देगा। इन माई प्रीवियस कंपनी, कुछ मेरे पिछले कंपनी में आई वुड क्रिएट सेल्स प्रोजेक्शन। तो मैंने जो है ना प्रोजेक्ट पिछले कंपनी में मैंने सेल्स पर प्रोजेक्ट बनाया था बेस्ड ऑन मार्केट, जो कि मार्केट पर बेस्ड था। और फैक्टर एंड टेक ऑनरशिप फॉर इंश्योरिंग दोज टारगेट्स वर मेट। और मैंने ऑनरशिप भी उस पर लिया था जिस पर कि मैंने अच्छा परफॉर्म किया था। ग्रेटेस्ट वीकनेस, और मेरा कुछ ऐसे वीकनेस, माई और ऑर्गेनाइजेशनल एलिबिलिटी हैज़ हैड द प्रॉब्लम टू रिड्यूस फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी। मेरे कुछ ऐसे आदत हैं जिसके कारण जो है कि मेरे को फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी है, क्योंकि समय के साथ बहने में पहले प्रॉब्लम होता था। दिस हैज कॉज प्रॉब्लम इन द पास्ट, जो कि पहले ऐसा होता था मेरे साथ कि मैं समय के साथ नहीं चल पाता था। However, I have taken the initiative. However, I have taken the initiative to create more redundancy in my plan। और बहुत से चीज़ जो है मैंने अब कम कर दिया, जिससे कि मेरा फोकस सिर्फ काम पर हो। दैट वाइल दे आर स्ट्रक्चर्ड, और जो कि स्ट्रक्चर मैंने जो डिसाइड कर दिया है वही करता हूँ। दे क्रिएटिव एंड फ्लेक्सिबल। अब मैं फ्लेक्सिबल हूँ, किसी भी था फ्लेक्सिबल एंड ओपन टू चेंज इफ देयर आर एनी अनफोर्सन चेंजेज इन द मार्केट। अब मैं कैपेबल हूँ कि इस मार्केट जैसे चेंज हो रहा है उस हिसाब से मैं सोच सकता हूँ, और क्या मार्केट का डिमांड है वो सब भी मैं अभी जानता हूँ, और मार्केट में किसको क्या चाहिए ये सब हमें अभी पता है। पहले वीकनेस था लेकिन अभी मैंने उसको मजबूत कर लिया है।
Now let's talk about the goals and motivations segment. Now, here is where we talk about the kinds of objectives that you're trying to move towards. So again, things to keep in mind. Number one, always consider both a short and a long-term goal. Now, what do I mean by this? Well, we're talking about short-term goals in the span of what do I want to do in the next month, 6 months, maximum about a year. Your long-term goals are goals that you want to achieve for your career as a entire structure, or maybe for your life in general. So a long-term goal could be, for example, something along the lines of making sure that you have a reputation, being remembered, being known, having people look back at you and recognize that you're in a position of authority. It could be something along the lines of just building a great life for your kids or something along those lines. Now, a short-term goal is a little bit different. Your short-term goal is generally going to be a lot more defined, precise, and specific. A short-term goal could be, for example, that within the next 1 year, I want to make sure that I'm able to achieve this position, or within the next 2 years, I want to achieve this position. It could be something related to your income. It could be something related to your skills development, that I want to know this, this, and this. It could be something relating to getting a stable position if you haven't already yet. It could be anything along those lines. A short-term goal is important to be able to understand what you're looking for right now. A long-term goal is important for you to be able to understand what you're looking for your career in general. Now, when you're talking about these kinds of goals, always assume that you're going to get the position when you discuss them, when you talk about them with the interviewer. This results in two things. Number one, it ensures that you're not preparing for failure. What that means is that you're giving yourself the kind of confidence to say,
तो यहाँ पर सबसे पहले तो दो कोर्स गोल, तो एक शॉर्ट कोर्स एंड और कुछ बड़े कोर्स है। तो शॉर्ट कोर्सेज जो होते हैं वो छोटे जिसे 2-3 महीने में जो कंप्लीट करते हैं, और बिगर गोल्स जो होते हैं या लॉन्ग टर्म गोल्स वो 6 साल और आप अपने फ्यूचर में अपने आप को कहाँ पर किस पोजीशन पर देखते हो, ये सब इसको डिसाइड करना है। थिंग्स टू कीप आउट माइंड में आप सोचें। ऑलवेज कंसीडर बोथ शॉर्ट टर्म एंड लॉन्ग टर्म गोल्स, दोनों जो है कंसीडर में करके रखें, शॉर्ट टर्म और लॉन्ग टर्म गोल्स। डोंट प्रिपेयर फॉर फेलियर, और आप जो प्रिपेयर करते हैं, एज्यूम यू विल गेट द पोजीशन। और फेलियर के बारे में फेलियर के बारे में अपना सोचा और उसके प्रिपेयर और उसको फेलियर को कैसे विनिंग में कन्वर्ट करना, ये इसके बारे में सोचे। कंसीडर बोथ इमीडिएट एंड कैरियर वाइड मोटिवेशन, ये सभी जितने भी वाइड मोटिवेशन इस सब ये सब भी देखा करें, जिसके कारण आपका बूस्ट होगा और अपने आप को मोटिवेट रखें। डोंट बी अफ्रेड टू मेंशन कंपनसेशन एज अ मोटिवेटर, और अपने आप को अफ्रेड ना हो, डरे ना, जो होगा लास्ट में सही ही होगा।
Say, I am the right fit for this job, and you would make a good decision in agreeing with me and hiring me for this position. It almost takes it as an obvious given, to the point where it is a smart decision. You should definitely make it. You should hire me for this position. It's subtle, but it's a movement towards the idea of getting them thinking about you already in the position and thinking of it as a good idea. Now, another reason why you want to assume that you get the position when making the goals is that naturally your short and long term goals are going to be iterative on the interviewer, the employer, understanding, okay, this is what this person is going to be doing, or how they're going to be interacting with my company once I hire them. So preparing for failure doesn't give any information that the interviewer wants to know. What they want to know is, if I hire this person, what will they be thinking about with their motivation for their short and long-term goals? And you definitely want to talk about both. Make sure that you do give both your immediate and your career-wide motivations, your short-term and your long-term plans. And lastly, and this is something that a lot of people tend to be shy about and tend not to actually discuss, don't be afraid to mention compensation as a motivator. Now, it's generally a better idea to talk about this in terms of eventually getting to a certain point. So talking about compensation in the long term rather than the short term, showing that you're willing to prove yourself before you're going to ask for that kind of raise. But it's important to also understand that as long as you're able to promise the interviewer, as long as you're able to showcase to the interviewer that the company will make more money from your actions than they will spend on you for their salary, any company is willing to offer a higher salary as a result of that. I mean, that's the reason why a lot of positions tend to make higher salaries than others, right? It's the simple fact of the matter that the more money you make for the company, the more comfortable they are in spending some of that money back on you, because at the end, they still benefit. You're still earning a percentage, a fraction of the money that you're bringing into the company. So as long as you're bringing in more money, as long as your position in the company is worth more in terms of company-oriented profits, they are always willing to give you more money in order to convince you to keep doing a great job. This is what incentive systems come from. This is why we have appraisals in companies, because it's a way to motivate you and encourage you to continue creating profit for the company. So don't be afraid to ask for compensation, but ensure that when you ask it, you are able to certify that you're willing to prove yourself and you're willing to show that you have what it takes to afford that salary from the company, because you can give them that much and much, much more. So again, let's look at some examples here in terms of some short-term and long-term goals and how we would talk about them. Let's begin with the short-term goal. I've recently gotten engaged to a beautiful woman, and I want to make use of some short-term and lower that salary from the.
जैसे कि यहाँ पे 4 पॉइंट के बारे में अच्छे से डिस्कस कर लें। और कहीं पर भी जो कोई भी कंपनी में किसी भी आदमी को किसी को हायर रैंक पर रखा जाता है, हायर पोजीशन पर फर्स्ट अटेम्प्ट में ही दिया जाता है, किसी को फेल भी किया जाता है। यहाँ पर सब मैटर करता है, तो उसके मोटिवेशन लेवल कैसा है, उसका स्किल लेवल्स कैसा है, यहाँ पर जैसे कि अब एग्ज़ाम देने जाते हैं तो सबका अपना अपना क्राइटेरिया होता है, उस बेसिस पर और उसका अपना IQ होता है, उस लेवल पर वो जो है अपना एग्ज़ाम देता है। और जो फेलियर है तो ऐसा नहीं है कि वो फेलियर है, वो जो फेलियर है आप देख सकते हो कि वो अच्छे लेवल पर भी जाता है। तो की प्रैक्टिस अपने आप को मोटिवेटेड रखते रहना। अगर फेलियर है तो फिर और भी कंपनी है, वहाँ पर आप हायर हो सकते हैं, वहाँ पर आपको जब मिल सकता है। तो अपने आप को मोटिवेटेड रखना है, और मोटिवेटेड का मतलब ये नहीं होता है अपने आप को हर वक्त अप टू डेट रखना है, और प्रैक्टिस टू प्रैक्टिस करते रहना है, और कहाँ पर आपका कमी है वो सबको दूर करना है इसे ना। उसके बाद आगे चलते हैं।
From the company because you can give them that much. Let's begin with the short-term goal.
अब इसके बाद यहाँ पर बात कर रहे हैं शॉर्ट टर्म गोल्स आपके क्या हो सकते हैं और लॉन्ग टर्म गोल्स क्या होते हैं, और मोटिवेशन साथ साथ में कैसे।
I've recently gotten engaged to a beautiful woman and I want to make sure I can build a future for the both of us. Immediately, we're talking about seeing this person as a family-oriented man. He is thinking about his goal as his wife, his spouse. I'm eager to prove myself in the company and hopefully climb the ranks so that I can provide a good life for my family. Again, as I said, assume that you're going to get the position. He's already talking about wanting to prove himself to the company and climb the ranks, not just about getting in the first place. I know that such things only come through hard work, and I'm eager to put in the hours to grow with the company. So he's talking about getting the position where he wants to grow in the company and move into that next level. Now, this isn't a total short-term goal. This isn't something that you can achieve in a couple months. This is, while it is relatively short in terms of a career growth, we are still talking about a year or two. But what he's saying here is, I want to make sure that within that year, I'm going to be in a stable position. He might not be yet, but he wants to be in a stable position to be able to move forward with his family, because he's at a very crucial point in his life where he's moving to the next level. So that's what we call a short-term goal. Right here, right now, I'm at a crucial point. I want to make sure I have the skills to move beyond it. I want to make sure that I'm able to create and divulge in such a way that I can make the right decision and move into a more comfortable long term. Now, let's look at the long-term goal here. I've always been in love with the fast-paced environment of sales. I'm also a natural extrovert, so I've made a lot of friends and had many networking opportunities over the years. In the long term, I'd like to consider to grow my career and develop my network of friends and business partners. Now, this is a goal that isn't really something that you can develop and call done. This is what we call an open-ended goal. You can never at any point say, okay, I've done it. I've succeeded. I've gotten to a point where I have all the network that I could want. A network is something that is constantly growing. So with a long-term goal and a long-term motivation, you want to try to move for these kinds of goals. With short-term goals, you want close-ended goals. You want goals where you can tick the box off and say, I've achieved that goal, now let's move on to the next one. But with long-term goals, the opposite is actually true. You want to start thinking of goals that you can never really truly achieve and always just sort of get closer and closer to that final end stage. Whether this be something along the lines of just growing in position, of making sure that you're able to grow with the company, of something along the lines of just compensation and position in general, or whether it's something a little bit less quantifiable, like in this case, networking and engaging with people and just living a good life and being happy. Grow in the company.
अब यहाँ अगर इमोशनल लाइन की बात आए तो इस टाइप का अगर लाइन अगर चेप देते हो तो एकदम मस्त ज़बरदस्त, और बंदा खुश हो जाएगा। हम देखते हैं क्या ऐसा। आई हैव रिसेंटली गोटन एंगेज टू ब्यूटीफुल। तो मैंने जो है ये हाल फिलहाल में एक ब्यूटीफुल गर्ल से शादी की है। ये हटा देते हैं। आई हैव रिसेंटली गोटन एंगेज टू अ ब्यूटीफुल वुमन, और मैंने रिसेंटली कुछ दिन पहले जो ब्यूटीफुल वुमन के साथ शादी किया है। एंड आई वांट टू मेक श्योर, और मैं अपने आप को स्पष्ट रूप से आई कैन बिल्ड अ फ्यूचर फॉर द बोथ, और मैं अपना और अपनी वाइफ का अच्छे से फ्यूचर बिल्डअप करना चाहता हूँ और बनाना चाहता हूँ, बोथ ऑफ अस, और दोनों का अच्छा फ्यूचर देखता हूँ और बनाना चाहता हूँ। आई एम एंगेज एगेज टू प्रूव माई सेल्फ इन द कंपनी, और मैं अपने अपने आप को प्रूव करना चाहता हूँ और अपने आप को अच्छे तौर पर देख करके, और मैं कंपनी का डेवलप सोचते हुए अपना भी डेवलप करना चाहता हूँ एंड होपफुली क्लाइम टू रैंक सो दैट, और मैं अपने आप को अच्छे रैंक पर पहुंचाना चाहता हूँ सो दैट आई कैन प्रोवाइड अ गुड लाइफ फॉर माय फैमिली, जिससे कि मैं अपने आप को एंड अपने 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 फैमिली मेम्बर को अच्छा लाइफ दे सकूँ और कंपनी में हायर रैंक पर जा सकूँ और व्हाट कॉपरेटिव। आई नो दैट सच थिंग्स ओनली कम्स थ्रू हार्ड वर्क, और मैं ऐसा जानता हूँ कि ये सब जो भी हैं ये सब सोचने से नहीं होता, करने से होता है, और ये इसके लिए हार्ड वर्किंग चाहिए। आई एम इंगेज टू पुट इन द आवर टू ग्रो विद द कंपनी, और मैं हमेशा तत्पर हूँ, और मैं हमें एक्स्ट्रा काम करने के लिए भी अवेलेबल हूँ कंपनी के विकास के लिए ना। उसके बाद हम दूसरा लाइन, ये सब मैं भी थोड़ा सा जोड़ देता हूँ, इस टाइप से बोलना है। फिर लॉन्ग टर्म के लिए आई हैव ऑलवेज बीन इन लव विद द फास्ट पेस्ड इन्वायरमेंट ऑफ सेल्स, फास्ट पेस्ड इन्वायरमेंट ऑफ सेल्स। तो मैं जो है ना मिला जुला अयम निज प्रवृत्ति गणना लघु चेत सामुदाय चरिता नाम तो वसुधैव कुटुम्बकम, यही एक लाइन अगर आप जब दोगे, अगर संस्कृत आता होगा तो पक्का वही फैन हो जाएगा आपका। तो यहाँ पर ऐसा है कि कुछ है ना, मैं इन्वायरमेंट के साथ और सेल्फ सब जो करता हूँ तो मैं एक्सट्रोवर्ट टाइप का हूँ और मिलनसार हूँ। आई एम ऑल्सो नेचुरल एक्सट्रोवर्ट। यहाँ पर तो ये लाइन ही बोल दिया है कि मैं एक्सट्रोवर्ट हुआ, और मैं एक इन्वायरमेंटल यानी कि आर्मी से रिलेटेड रहता हूँ। सो आई हैव मेड अ लॉट ऑफ फ्रेंड्स, जिसके कारण मैंने बहुत से फ्रेंड बनाए एंड हैड मैनी नेटवर्किंग अपॉर्चुनिटी, और मेरे पास जो है ना बहुत से नेटवर्किंग अपॉर्चुनिटी हैं ओवर द ईयर। और इस ईयर में ओवर द ईयर हमारे नेटवर्क अपॉर्चुनिटी हमारे बढ़ते जा रहे हैं, और कुछ है इन द लॉन्ग टर्म में आई हैड लाइक टू कंटिन्यू टू ग्रो, और समय के साथ साथ मैं ग्रो ही करते जाऊँगा, पीछे आने की कोई वजह नहीं है। माई करियर एंड डेवलप्स माई नेटवर्क ऑफ फ्रेंड्स एंड बिजनेस पार्टनर, जो कि मेरे करियर और फ्रेंड्स जो है ना समय के साथ साथ बढ़ते ही जाएंगे, और इससे जो है ये कंपनी का भी बेनिफिट्स होगा अगर कंपनी मेरे को हायर करती है तो। मैं हार्ड वर्किंग हूँ और कंपनी को मैं बहुत कुछ अपन हार्ड वर्किंग के साथ हार्ड वर्किंग मैं अपना इससे मेरा भी मोटिव है कि मैं अपने आप को अच्छे रैंक पर देखना चाहता हूँ, हायर सैलरी चाहता हूँ, तो मैं कंपनी के ग्रोथ और विकास के बारे में भी सोचूंगा ना। उसके बाद हम दूसरे चैप्टर पर चलते हैं।
Next, are you comfortable with? Now, here we're going to talk about some of the questions that people might ask you, but these are generally going to be very simple to answer. Most of these are going to be yes or no, but a lot of times people feel pressured to either answer more flexibly than they really have the flexibility for, and that will often come to bite you in the back if it gets to the point where they will ask you to take a position that you might have said yes for, and now that's going to trouble you either because you have other commitments, you have family who is going to get anxious or upset if you're out too late or anything along those lines, or alternatively, if you're in a position where you are able to go, but it's going to affect you in a negative way. So be honest with yourself and be able to understand that some positions like weekend shifts or like late hours are not necessarily for everyone. If you can, that's generally a good idea. Flexibility is always good, but it's important not to overcommit. If they ask, they intend to call your bluff. If a company is asking you if you're comfortable with the European or American shift, for example, that is because they intend to get you to work it. So if you are not the type of person who can stay outside of the house, or in the case of work from home, can stay up and on the computer and call during the late hours of the night, then you want to make that clear now. Don't overcommit. Next, make sure that you do ask for details. A lot of times when they ask you if you're comfortable with a type of position, there will generally
थिंग्स टू कीप इन माइंड. फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी इज गुड. फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी तो गुड है कि समय के साथ आपको चेंज होते रहना चाहिए और जैसा मार्केट में चल रहा है उसके जैसा एक्वायर्ड करेक्टर भी लेना चाहिए जिसके कारण कि आप जो है मार्केट में आप बने रहो. डोंट ओवर कमिट. आप जो है कभी भी ओवर कमिट ना कर दो कि इफ़ दे आस्क दे इंटेंड टू कॉल यू ब्लफ. और यहाँ पर जो बड़बोला नहीं बनना है. जितना आपका कैपेबिलिटी हो उतना ही. ज़्यादा अगर बोल दो और फिर उसके बाद वो आपका कमिटमेंट अगर आपका कंप्लीट नहीं होगा तो आपका इमेज ख़राब हो सकता है कंपनी में. देन आस्क फॉर डिटेल्स. हाँ, ये सब ट्रेवल अलाउंस, नाइट शिफ्ट अलाउंस, etc. ये सब के बारे में भी आगे भी बात करें. ये सब बहुत मैटर करता है नाइट शिफ्ट सब.
be leeways associated with it. Companies will sometimes give travel allowance if they're asking if you're comfortable with moving. Lots of business development experts and lots of operatives in that field tend to travel a lot. Your company may be centered in one city, but they might ask you to move towards other cities. So if they ask if you're comfortable with travel, ensure that you do clarify whether or not they have travel allowances associated with the company. Next, night shift allowance is another common thing that a lot of companies have for sales jobs, particularly telesales jobs. Now, a night shift allowance is essentially an extra bit of money that is afforded to you as an incentive to working the late hours. So this is something that a lot of companies offer in BPO environments and in other sales-oriented environments in order to encourage that attitude and in order to encourage people to take those kinds of late shifts, even if they might not initially be comfortable with them. Additionally, sales representatives, particularly in the telesales department, tend to, on average, earn higher salaries in the international market simply because they are higher value customers that they're dealing with. So that might be a consideration as well. And that's another reason why flexibility is good. So that if they do plug you into the international teams, that's something that might be something you can consider talking about when salary discussions come into play.
इसके बारे में तो मैंने बता ही दिया, तो फिर इसके बाद आगे ही चलते हैं.
Next, are you comfortable with? Now, here we're going to talk about some of the questions that people might ask you, but these are generally going to be very simple to answer. Most of these are going to be yes or no, but a lot of times people feel pressured to either answer more flexibly than they really have the flexibility for, and that will often come to bite you in the back if it gets to the point where they will ask you to take a position that you might have said yes for, and now that's going to trouble you either because you have other commitments, you have family who is going to get anxious or upset if you're out too late or anything along those lines, or all.
ये आ जाता है कंफर्टेबल विद. यहाँ पर जो है फ्लेक्सिबिलिटी तो इस समय के साथ ऐसा नहीं होता कि यहाँ पर चेंज होना पड़ता है जो कन्फर्म है, और आप कोई भी ऐसा ओवर कमिट पे ना करते हैं कि जो कि आपसे हो ना पाए, और उससे और जो भी आपका एक्चुअली टाइम जो लगे उतना ही ना, कि ये जो कि 2 दिन में काम होने वाला है आप 10 दिन में बोलो, और जो 10 दिन वाला है काम वो 2 दिन में कर दो. तो जो आपका नेचुरल है जो जिसमें आप कंफर्ट होकर के काम कर सको. कभी कभी ट्रेवल करने में भी ये सब भी प्रॉब्लम होता है. नाइट शिफ्ट सब तो आप देख लो, अगर आप कैपेबल हो नाइट शिफ्ट करने में तो आप सब ये सब हायर करो. वो सब डिस्कस करना वहीं पर होता है. आप अगर किसी कंपनी के साथ ज्वाइन करते हो तो, और उसका नाइट शिफ्ट अगर होता है तो उसका क्या क्या फैसिलिटीज़ दिया जाता है वो सब के बारे में यहाँ पर बताया जाएगा.
Alternatively, if you're in a position where you are able to go, but it's going to affect you in a negative way. So be honest with yourself and be able to understand that some positions like weekend shifts or like late hours are not necessarily for everyone. If you can, that's generally a good idea. Flexibility is always good, but it's important not to overcommit. If they ask, they intend to call your bluff. If a company is asking you if you're comfortable with the European or American shift, for example, that is because they intend to get you to work it. So if you are not the type of person who can stay outside of the house, or in the case of work from home, can stay up and on the computer and call during the late hours of the night, then you want to make that clear now. Don't overcommit. Next, make sure that you do ask for details. A lot of times when they ask you if you're comfortable with a type of position, there will generally be leeways associated with it. Companies will sometimes give travel allowance if they're asking if you're comfortable with moving. Lots of business development experts and lots of operatives in that field tend to travel a lot. Your company may be centered in one city, but they might ask you to move towards other cities. So if they ask if you're comfortable with travel, ensure that you do clarify whether or not they have travel allowances associated with allowances and other common things.
यहाँ पर प्रतिष्ठा में प्राण गंवाने वाली बात नहीं है। यहाँ पर जो आपके साथ कंफर्टेबल हो, आप जो जिसमें कंफर्ट हो करके कंपनी को भी चाहिए कि आप अगर कोई उसका काम कर रहे हो, कभी आपके पास टाइम ना हो, आप फास्ट में कोई काम करो। मान लो कि आप कभी डाई बनाते हो और आपको एक डाई लगभग 10 से 15 लाख का बनता है, मे भी 25 लाख का भी बनता है, कुछ करोड़ों का डाई बनता है। आप उस पर काम कर रहे हो, थोड़ा सा भी मिस्टेक उसमें अगर हो गया, थोड़ा सा आप चिड़चिड़ा हो या घर में कोई प्रॉब्लम है, वो टेंशन है, आप वो काम कर रहे हो और आप वो उसमें थोड़ा सा भी मिस्टेक कर देते हो तो लाखों का नुकसान हो जाता है। तो फिर उसके बाद ट्रेवल आप लॉन्ग डिस्टेंस पर हो, आप बोल रहे हो कि मैं लगभग उस ट्रेवल डिस्टेंस हो सकता है आपको एक सिटी से दूसरे सिटी तक काम करने के लिए जाना होता होगा, एक बहुत प्रॉब्लम हो जाता है। फिर ट्रैफिक सब सिस्टम भी होता है जिसके कारण आप लेट हो सकते हो। फिर उसके बाद नाइट शिफ्ट आपकी फैमिली भी है, उसके साथ भी टाइम स्पेंड करना है, ये सब भी देखना होता है। तो ये सब ध्यान में रख करके एक ही बार में सब कुछ डिस्कस कर लो उनसे।
Thing that a lot of companies have for sales jobs, particularly telesales jobs. Now, a night shift allowance is essentially an extra bit of money that is afforded to you as an incentive to working the late hours. So this is something that a lot of companies offer in BPO environments and in other sales-oriented environments in order to encourage that attitude and in order to encourage people to take those kinds of late shifts, even if they might not initially be comfortable with them. Additionally, sales representatives, particularly in the telesales department, tend to, on average, earn higher salaries in the international market simply because they are higher value customers that they're dealing with. So that might be a consideration as well. And that's another reason why flexibility is good. So that if they do plug you into the international teams, that's something that might be something you can consider talking about when salary discussions come into play.
ये वीडियो लेक्चर में पास चलाने वाला हूँ क्योंकि ये 22 मिनट का है। तो
Next, let's talk about the sell me segments. Now, a sell me question is going to be anything along the lines of hard sales, soft sales. There's a lot of different ways that you can sell a product. So it's important that you understand what exactly they're asking from you here. Now, essentially, this is a request for a demonstration of your skills. It's a demonstration of how well you can actually sell a product. It's a demonstration of what you'll be doing when you're with the company itself in terms of how you'll be opening your sales pitch, how you'll be interacting with the customer, how you'll be closing the pitch, and how you'll be checking if the customer is engaged or not. And whether or not you're able to get back to that will tell a lot about who you are.
सबसे पहले ये बताएगा थिंग्स टू कीप इन माइंड। सब दिमाग में सोचना, दिस इज अ रिक्वेस्ट फॉर अ डेमोन्स्ट्रेशन ऑफ योर स्किल। आइडेंटिफाई द सेल्स टेक्निक दैट कंपनी इज यूजिंग। हार्डवेयर वर्सेस सॉफ्ट सेल्स, हार्ड सेल्स वर्सेस सॉफ्ट सेल्स, प्रोडक्ट ड्राइवन वर्सेस सॉल्यूशन ड्राइवन सेल्स, B2C versus B2B sales.
You are the salesperson. So let's try to solve this question. Let's try to solve the sell me this question. And the first thing that you want to do is remember the research that you've done in the beginning. Right? Remember for our session 1, we talked about doing the pre-work, and a big part of that was doing the research. Now herein is where that research will start becoming helpful. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to try to identify the sale tactic that the company is using. A really easy way to do this is to go on any other advertisements or to go on their product page on their website and try to identify what it is that they're doing in order to engage with the client product. Now, sometimes you can pretend to buy a product as well and go through the running and go through the listing. And if that's necessary, that's something that you can absolutely do. However, most of the time, you can simply take face value from the website itself, and that will generally give you an understanding of what kind of sales tactic we're looking at here. So let's look at all the different sales tactics and talk about how you can identify which one they're using based on the advertisement or website details. So let's look at hard versus soft sales. Now, hard sales is essentially the process by which there is a large amount of pressure that is involved in trying to make a customer to come to a decision as quickly and with as little information as possible. Hard sell prioritizes the idea of fear of missing out and the idea of propagating and pressuring the idea that one must buy now or else they'll do something big. They've got to push the customer towards that level of urgency in that sense of moving towards the end goal. Soft sales, on the other hand, is a lot more laid back and generally just involves having a conversation with the customer and talking to them about the product. Now, generally, the distinction, the difference between hard and soft sales can be quickly understood by how much actual information is plugged on the advertisement and how conveniently or inconveniently that information is plugged together. If most of the ad is moving towards the idea of encouraging people to jump in now, go today, and doesn't really contain all that much detail about the product besides people feeling good and engaging with it in a positive way, there's a lot of smiles and very little actual content. That's generally when you say that you're moving towards a hard sell. That's a company that is generally preferring a hard sell approach to a soft sell approach. On the other hand, a soft sale would generally have advertisements that read more like infomercials than ads. Their website will contain a lot of information about the product. They will generally have a lot of infomercials trying to give information about what the product is as much as possible. These types of companies will generally have fairly large websites. Oftentimes they will have blogs on their websites as well, or lots of testimonials, lots of video recordings to showcase their actual products, anything along those lines. The more information there is about the product on the website, the more likely that it is that they're moving towards a soft sale approach, where they want you to share that information, where they want you to actually talk through all the benefits of the program, rather than just pressuring the movement towards, this is the right thing for you, this is the best way to move forward, we need to do this now. Instead, the soft sales approach is very much a relaxed approach of, these are the things that we have, what do you think? Do you want to move forward? Next, we have product-driven versus solution-driven sales. Now, this is a little bit less easy to navigate because product-driven and solution-driven sales, the difference between them tends to be much more personalized. It's very difficult to do solution-driven sales on content like a website or an advertisement because of the simple fact that many people will have different problems and thus different solutions. So the general idea that you want to move towards is that if the product, quote unquote, sells itself, or if the product is something that is motivated in general by a sort of overarching aspect of an everyday or an everyman item, for example, Coca-Cola, their sales are going to be product driven because there's not a problem which the product solves. It's just the idea of this is going to make you happy. This is going to give you joy regardless of the context. However, if what you're selling is much more specific, if what you're selling is a solution to a given problem, generally you're going to want solution driven sales. So a product that is not an everyman product, a product that is very niche or specific, or that is only really going to be utilized by a specific group of people is going to generally favor solution driven sales. For example, the kind of things that we do here at Great Learning, we offer courses that allow you to upskill your career. Now, the same course is not going to be utilized for everyone. So in our case, for example, we would definitely go through a solution-driven sales approach if we were to sell a course. Another example of what we could sell with a solution-driven approach is if you were to sell some sort of electronic device that might solve a customer's given problem. Hearing aids, spectacles, computers, laptops, these kinds of things generally move towards solution-driven sales. Now, some of them can also be product-driven sales, but that's only if you know who it is that you are selling to and that you're able to understand that they know the solution that they want and they're just sort of competing between competitors. When you're in that kind of extent, it's generally a good idea to simply list off the features of the product and talk about how our product is better than the competitors that might also solve the same problem, that might also deliver the same solution, but might do it in a slightly different way, or with benefits that our program doesn't necessarily, or with benefits that our program might provide that theirs doesn't necessarily provide. Next, it's important to consider who exactly you're selling to. B2C versus B2B sales tends to be very, very different. A B2C sale, a business to customer sale, is something where you are selling directly to the end user who will be using that product. A B2B sale, or business to business sale, is generally employing your business's product and selling it to another business, either for that business to utilize it in a way that helps them grow forward. For example, if you sell parts for factory machines, you'd be selling to other businesses which would then use those parts in their factories in order to sell their products. So that's a B2B sale. Alternatively, B2B sales can also employ things like wholesale sales to distributors. Those would also be considered a B2B. Now, in a B2C case, you're dealing with usually, not always, but usually smaller sums of money at any given time, but you're also dealing with people who can make decisions much more quickly. A B2C sale is generally made very, very fast, and that kind of turnover does result in a pretty big impact of the kind of sale that you can make. As such, things like hard sales tend to work a lot better in B2C sales because of the simple fact of the matter that a B2C customer or someone who is buying a product for themselves usually doesn't need some level of approval before making the decision to actually buy the product. So it does make sense for you to pressure them into buying now because the longer they think about the product, the more time your competitors have to swoop in. However, when we're talking about B2B sales, that kind of approach doesn't really work because in a B2B sale, there's so much red tape involved in actually making that sale that it tends to be a lot more difficult to move at that kind of speed. So with a B2B sale, it's important that you understand who exactly the decision maker is, how you can ensure that you are able to either speak to them directly or have whoever speaks to them ensure that they detail and discuss your product in a positive light. So there is going to be some amount of understanding about the hierarchy of the client's company when you're making a B2B sale. And that's generally information that most B2B clients, after they've had at least a brief conversation of the fact that your product is something that is useful to them, will be able to share with you. So you can openly ask, are you the decision maker? And if the answer is no, then you can either ask to speak to the decision maker or give them tips and pointers to speak to the decision maker, depending on how close you're able to build rapport with this person. On the other hand, if you are speaking to the decision maker directly, this will often turn into something of a B2C call in that you will try to often push them to make that decision as soon as possible. But if you're not speaking to the decision maker, it is important to slow down a little bit and ensure that they have all of the ammunition that is necessary in order to go ahead and move forward to the next step. And naturally, always show that you are available for them to reach out to and interact with if they need any further information or if the decision maker would like to either speak to you or ask any further questions which require your follow-up. So let's look at a few examples here. First of all, the classic example, sell me this pen. Now, this example is one that has plagued both movie sales and actual sales departments, but sometimes it can still be useful and sometimes it has value nonetheless. Now, regarding movie sales and actual sales, classic example, sell me this, would like to either speak to you or ask any further questions which require. There's so much.
तो यहाँ पर सेल में दिस, यहाँ पर जो सबसे बड़ा यही होता है कि यहाँ पर बेचने की प्रक्रिया, यहाँ पर जो भी है कि यहाँ पर बोला जाएगा कि कोई भी अगर शॉर्ट से करते हैं, एक पेन होता है, एक एग्जाम्पल था तो आप सबको मालूम होगा कि एक पेन बेचने के लिए क्या क्या करता है। कोई एक ही पेन को जो है मतलब 10,000 में बेचता है, कोई 5 रुपये में बेचता है, तो सबको अपना अपना डिफरेंस होता है और उसका मार्केटिंग करने का तरीका अलग होता है। तो यहाँ पर यही मैटर करता है, आपका मार्केटिंग करने का स्किल्स क्या है, आपके पास क्राइटेरिया क्या है, आपका तरीका क्या है। अगर उसमें समथिंग चेंज और कुछ आप अच्छे से, जैसे कि अभी एप्पल पेन की बात करें तो 10,000 के आसपास में बिक रहा है, और जो कि दूसरा पेन है 5 रुपये में बिक रहा है। तो कुछ ऐसा मॉडिफाइड किया है, ऐसा सिस्टम डेवलप किया है जिसके कारण जो है अब एप्पल का पेन 10,000 रुपये में मिलता है। दिस थिंग टू कीप इन माइंड। और उससे भी और भी अच्छे अच्छे पेन हैं जो कि जर्मनी फ्रांस सब में बनता है, जो कि एस्ट्रोनॉट सब लेकर जाते हैं, उससे भी महंगा पेन सब है। आई थिंक अगर ये पेन बन गया तो अब वो सब पेन लेकर जाने का ज़रूरत नहीं है, क्योंकि ये 10,000 का पेन ही काम कर जाएगा, मे बी वाईफाई के थ्रू हो सकता है। थिंग्स टू कीप इन माइंड, दिस इज अ रिक्वेस्ट फॉर अ डेमोन्स्ट्रेशन ऑफ स्किल। यहाँ पर जो है ना सबसे सबसे बड़ा तो फैक्ट यही आता है कंपनी में कि सबसे पहले जो है ना आपका इस स्किल्स इसमें क्या है, आप कैसे सेल्स कर सकते हैं। आइडेंटिफाई द सेल्स टेक्निक दैट द कंपनी इज यूजिंग। और आपको जो है ना पता करना है कि कैसे जो है कंपनी सेल्स कैसे करती है, उसकी स्ट्रेटजी क्या है, वो क्या कंपनी बनाती है और उसका कैसे सेल्स करती है, उस सब के बारे में आपको टेक्निक सीखना चाहिए, टेक्निक सीखना चाहिए। हार्ड वर्सेस सॉफ्टवेयर। हार्ड वर्सेस या तो दो तरीके से समझ सकता है। हार्ड वो हो गया जो कि हार्ड मतलब, और सॉफ्ट रीडिंग सब जो होता है वो सेल होता है। और हार्ड मीन्स कोई पार्ट्स जस्ट लाइक आयरन रोड सब होता है, और भी कुछ हार्डवेयर और सॉफ्टवेयर ले लेते हैं इस टाइप से। प्रोडक्ट ड्रिवन वर्सेस सॉल्यूशन ड्रिवन से सेल्स। प्रोडक्ट ड्रिवन और सॉल्यूशन में कुछ न्यू प्रोडक्ट बना करके, कुछ रॉ मटेरियल्स बना करके वो सब देखना है। B2C और B2B सेल्स। The simplest distinction between hard sell and a soft sell is that hard sell is a direct, hard sell जो होता है वो डायरेक्ट होता है, एंड शॉर्ट टर्म सेल, और ये शॉर्ट टर्म एंड सॉफ्ट सेल इज एन इनडायरेक्ट, ये इनडायरेक्ट लॉन्ग टर्म सेल। मोस्ट सेल्स एक्सपर्ट विल रिकमेंडेड द सॉफ्ट सेल्स, और जो ज़्यादा जो एक्सपर्ट्स होते हैं वो सॉफ्ट सेल्स को मान्यता, क्योंकि ये लॉन्ग टर्म से, और लॉन्ग टर्म अगर शेयर मार्केट में ही शेयर करें तभी रुपया आता है। और उसके बाद आता है प्रोडक्ट ड्राइवन एनर्जी। प्रोडक्ट ड्राइवन एनवायरनमेंट इन्वॉल्व्स द बिजनेस डेवलपिंग अ प्रोडक्ट फर्स्ट। ये जो होता है एनवायरनमेंट क्रिएट किया जाता है डेवलपिंग अ प्रोडक्ट फर्स्ट, देन सर्चिंग फॉर अ मार्केट कहाँ पर वो उसका है, उसके लिए पहले तो प्रोडक्ट बनाया जाता है, फिर उसका मार्केट देखा जाता है। इट ऑपरेट्स अंडर द assumptions that with great products come great customers। अगर अच्छा प्रोडक्ट अच्छा है तो फिर उसके कस्टमर भी अच्छे हैं, विच इन टर्न ब्रिंग इन द प्रॉफिट एंड रेवेन्यू, जो कि प्रॉफिट और रेवेन्यू में कन्वर्ट हो जाए। ऑल देयर एफर्ट्स एंड रिसोर्सेज विल बी पावर्ड इनटू द प्रोडक्ट्स, और सभी जो रिसोर्सेज सब जो प्रोडक्ट में पावर्ड है ना। इसके बाद यहाँ पर जो प्रोडक्ट ड्रिवन स्ट्रेटजी इन्वॉल्व द बिजनेस प्रोडक्ट रिसर्चिंग मार्केट, ये हो चुका है ना। उसके बाद जो है नटसेल और सॉल्यूशन ड्राइवन स्ट्रेटजी क्या होता है उसके बारे में। इन अ नटसेल, अ सॉल्यूशन ड्राइवन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन डज एवरीथिंग फ्रॉम द कस्टमर रिस्पेक्टिव फर्स्ट। सबसे पहले जो है सॉल्यूशन ड्राइवन ऑर्गेनाइजेशन जो है वो डज एवरीथिंग फ्रॉम द कस्टमर पर्सपेक्टिव फर्स्ट। जो भी कस्टमर के पर्सपेक्टिव होता है वो सब करता है। दैट कस्टमर फर्स्ट अप्रोच सिंप्लीफाई, जिससे कि कस्टमर जो है प्रोडक्ट लेने के लिए और उसके प्रोडक्ट और कस्टमर के बीच रिलेशन सिंपल मेथड ट्राई करता है, जैसे कि कस्टमर और प्रोडक्ट एक दूसरे से को ले मतलब कंज्यूमर्स प्रोडक्ट ले सके। एवरीथिंग यूरोस प्रोडक्ट और ये सब जो है प्रोडक्ट्स टीम पर डिपेंड करता है। मार्केटिंग सेल्स एंड क्लाइंट सर्विस पर डिपेंड है बिकॉज कस्टमर गोल्स एंड सक्सेस मैट्रिक्स आर द सेंटर प्राइस। ये सब जो है मेन गोल होता है और इसी की वजह से ये सोल्यूशन ड्राइवन स्ट्रेटजी हो पाता है। और उसके बाद सोल्यूशन ड्राइवर एनर्जी भी कंप्लीट करते हैं मैंने। फिर द टर्म बिजनेस कंज्यूमर, द टर्म बिजनेस टू कंज्यूमर B2C सेल्स क्या होता है? द टर्म बिजनेस टू कंज्यूमर refer to the process of selling products and services directly business and consumer who are end users of the product or service. Most companies that sell directly to the consumer can be referred to as B2C। जो बिजनेस टू बिजनेस जाता है तो वो ज़्यादा ग्रो नहीं करता है, लेकिन बिजनेस टू अगर कंज्यूमर तक अगर पहुंच गया तो ये ज़्यादा तक माना गया। जैसे कि नापतोल बचत बाजार सब जो है ये सब जो है डायरेक्ट कंपनी बनाती है और वो डायरेक्ट ज़्यादा उसके बीच में नहीं आता है, तो कम लागत में कंज्यूमर को मिल जाता है, तो इसके कारण ये सब कंपनी ज़्यादा बढ़ता है। और फिर उसके बाद कोई भी कंपनी है वो दोनों में एक इम्पोर्टेंट रोल अदा करता है। B2C और बिजनेस टू बिजनेस भी अच्छा है। अगर दोनों एक साथ अगर लेकर के चलते हैं तो बहुत कंपनी कभी भी नीचे नहीं गिरेगी। B2B सेल्स, ये बिजनेस टू बिजनेस सेल्स refers to the transaction that occur between two businesses in its most basic form. One company or business sells a product or services to another business. A common example is a tech company that sells digital marketing software to other companies, that is a B2B sell। यहाँ पर जो है एक कंपनी जो सॉफ्टवेयर बनाता है और दूसरे कंपनी को बेचता है, ये सब जो है बिजनेस टू बिजनेस और सेल्स होता है। और दोनों का एक अपने अपने जगह पर एक इम्पोर्टेंट रोल अदा करता है। और अगर बिजनेस टू बिजनेस और बिजनेस टू कंज्यूमर अगर किसी भी कंपनी के साथ अगर जुड़ जाता है दोनों के क्राइटेरिया पर, तो फिर उस कंपनी को कोई भी तोड़ने वाला नहीं है, ऐसा मान करके चले ना। इसके बाद यहाँ से आगे चलते हैं।
Red tape involved in actually making that sale, that it tends to be a lot more difficult to move at that kind of speed. So with a B2B sale, it's important that you understand who exactly the decision maker is, how you can ensure that you are able to either speak to them directly or have whoever speaks to them ensure that they detail and discuss your product in a positive light. So there is going to be some amount of understanding about the hierarchy of the client's company when you're making a B2B sale. And that's generally information that most B2B clients, after they've had at least a brief conversation of the fact that your product is something that is useful to them, will be able to share with you. So you can openly ask, are you the decision maker? And if the answer is no, then you can either ask to speak to the decision maker or give them tips and pointers to speak to the decision maker, depending on how close you're able to build rapport with this person. On the other hand, if you are speaking to the decision maker directly, this will often turn into something of a B2C call, in that you will try to often push them to make that decision as soon as possible. But if you're not speaking to the decision maker, it is important to slow down a little bit and ensure that they have all of the ammunition that is necessary in order to go ahead and move forward to the next step. And naturally, always show that you are available for them to reach out to and interact with if they need any further information, or if the decision maker would like to either speak to you or ask any further questions which require your follow-up. So let's look at a few examples here. First of all, the classic example, sell me this pen. Now, this example is one that has plagued both movie sales and actual sales departments, but sometimes it can still be useful, and sometimes it has value nonetheless. Now, regardless of whether you might or might not personally agree in whether it has real value in terms of the business today, it is still something that interviewers may often ask, and it is often a necessity to impress them in this question in order to get that job. So let's see how we can impress the interviewer with the sell me this pen question. So let's talk about it. Even in our heavily technology-oriented world with computers and smartphones, pens remain an incredibly useful tool in modern business. While physical documents are less common now, physical signatures are still an important way businessmen like you seal contracts and give authorization to banks, educational institutions, and government documentation. A pen like this one is both stylish and affordable, and I think it's a great fit for a man like you. So this is a soft sales approach, which orients around a solution-driven sale for a B2C individual. So moving back to our previous cases, in hard versus soft sales, what you're doing is you are dealing with a soft sale approach. You're detailing what exactly the pen is able to do, and you're talking about the product itself and giving that kind of information to the customer. Next, we're moving towards a solution-driven approach. Rather than just talking about the product in a vacuum, we are talking about the pen, not just as a pen, we're talking about the pen as a solution to some problem that the customer might have, which in this case is being able to still keep in touch with physical documentation, which is still important today. And finally, we're using a B2C approach instead of a B2B approach because this is the person that we're selling to. So let's break down this specific point that we've gone through. So the first sentence here, even in our heavily technology-oriented world with computers and smartphones, pens remain an incredibly useful tool in modern business. You start by discussing what exactly the product is and the kinds of solutions that it can be afforded to. You praise it. You discuss the product as an advantageous thing to have. You say that having my product, having this product that I'm selling to you, is going to make you feel good because it's very useful. It's very effective. Then we go ahead and explain why. While physical documents are less common now, we accept that. Physical signatures are still an important way businessmen like you seal contracts and give authorizations to banks, educational institutions, and government documentation. So what am I doing? I'm saying that this pen is useful to you, and then I'm telling you why. People may not write down notes on physical pieces of paper as often anymore with how computers and phones have taken that role. People may not send each other physical letters nearly as often, again, with how technology has taken that role. But there's still more than enough reasons why having a good pen is definitely going to have a lot of value, both in terms of the aesthetic and in terms of the usefulness as well. Then we go to the last point. Now, this last sentence is the only time that we're actually selling this product. And this is indicative of a lot of soft sales, is that soft sale will generally only really talk about the sale approach once they've given a lot of information about the product and related that information to the customer, businessmen like you. So a pen like this one is both stylish and affordable, and I think that it's a great fit for a man like you. This is our final sales pitch. We're talking about the fact that our product is better than the competitors. It is stylish, and it is affordable, and it's a great fit for a man like you. Next, let's move on to the other question here, which tends to be very, very common. Companies will often ask you to sell their own product to them. Now, this is obviously going to vary tremendously, but this is going to require you to have an understanding of what the customer wants and how exactly the product will be able to satisfy that. So oftentimes what you can do is, rather than have a sort of monologue approach the way we did for the Sell Me This Pen, instead we can have a question-answer approach for something like this, wherein you'll be able to get an understanding of who the customer is and what it is that they do, and move forward in that way. So a second type of common question is the sell me our product question, which tends to come up a lot for many, many different companies in terms of what exactly they're selling and asking you to then sell that product for them. So for the demo, you'll be selling it to them, but naturally this demo is being used as an understanding of how well you'll be able to sell the product on the floor. Now this is generally going to be utilized by companies that don't require an enormous amount of training.
तो यहाँ पर बात करते हैं, तो यहाँ पर इवन इन आवर हैवली टेक्नोलॉजी, जब यहाँ की हमारी जो टेक्नोलॉजी के बढ़ते रहा है, टेक्नोलॉजी ओरिएंटेड वर्ल्ड विद कंप्यूटर्स एंड स्मार्टफोन से, जिसमें कि कंप्यूटर के दौर में और हमारी की जैसे कि जनरेशन टू जनरेशन अगर बताएं तो एनवायरमेंट चेंजेस के साथ साथ हम जो है टेक्नोलॉजी के दौर में आगे बढ़ते हुए, जो कि कंप्यूटर और स्मार्टफोन्स का ज़माना है, वहाँ पर पेन रिमेन इनक्रेडिबली यूजफुल टूल्स इन मॉडर्न बिजनेस। और यहाँ पर जो पेन को कैसे मॉडिफाई, और पहले जो था पेन आता था कॉपी और पेन में जो है ना बहुत से मतलब कि वो प्लांट सब करते, तो इस सब को जो है ना उस बेसिस पर मैंने इससे पहले भी बताया कि एप्पल पेन सब ऐसा जो है डिजिटल का ज़माना है, और सभी बंदे जो है ना, जैसे कि मैं अभी पढ़ने के साथ साथ जो है रिकॉर्ड भी कर रहा हूँ, तो इस टाइप का अब ज़माना है, तो इस हिसाब से जो है समय के साथ बढ़ते जाना है। और यहाँ पर जो है इसी टाइप से ऐसा कुछ बनाए जो कि पर्सन को जो है कंफर्टनेस दे, तो इस टाइप से एप्पल पेंसिल सब का भी मांग है, और इससे भी जो ज़्यादा जो भी पेंसिल सब आएगा उस सब का मांग बढ़ते जाएगा। वाइल फिजिकल डॉक्यूमेंट्स आर लेस कॉमन, जबकि फिजिकल डॉक्यूमेंट लेस कॉमन हो। अब जो फिजिकल जो भी डॉक्यूमेंट्स सब है वो सब का काम चल रहा है, अब अधिकतर से जो है ऑनलाइन काम हो रहा है। फिजिकल सिग्नेचर्स आर स्टिल एन इम्पोर्टेंट, फिजिकल सिग्नेचर जो है वो इम्पोर्टेंट हो सकता है। वे बिजनेसमैन लाइक यू सील कॉन्ट्रैक्ट्स एंड गिव ऑथराइजेशन टू बैंक, ये सब के लिए जो है ना पेन तो चलेगा ही उस टाइम। एजुकेशनल इंस्टीट्यूट, हाँ, अगर आपको जहाँ पेन पर है तो आप जैसे कि पेन डिपेंड करता है, अगर आपके पास बॉल पेन है और एप्पल पेन है तो ये डिपेंड करता है कि आप स्टूडेंट सबको दो, और वहाँ पर जहाँ पर स्टूडेंट्स एजुकेशन फैकल्टीज हो वैसे सब जगह पर आप एडवर्टाइजमेंट करो, गवर्नमेंट ऑफ डॉक्यूमेंटेशन ऑफिस सब में जाओ, वहाँ पर पहले प्रचार प्रसार करो, और फिर जो भी सस्ते से सस्ते और अच्छे सस्ते में अच्छा अगर दोगे तो कंपनी कस्टमर पकड़ेगा, और फिर आपके बाद प्रॉफिट होगा। एप्पल लाइक दिस वन इज बोथ स्टाइलिश एंड अफोर्डेबल, और स्टाइलिश और अफोर्डेबल और कंफर्टनेस प्रोवाइड करे पेन, और इस टाइप का पेन बनना चाहिए। एंड आई थिंक इट्स अ ग्रेट फिट फॉर अ मैन लाइक यू, और ये जो है बहुत अच्छा होगा पेन के लिए और आपके बिजनेस के लिए भी। सेल मी आवर प्रोडक्ट, आप जो है आप अपना प्रोडक्ट जो है मेरे को कैसे बेचेंगे, चलो कैसे, तो मैं सबसे पहले ऑफकोर्स सर व्हेन आई एम ट्राइंग टू सेल माई प्रोडक्ट्स टू यू। तो यहाँ पर कुड आई आस्क यू फ्यू क्वेश्चन, क्या मैं आपसे कुछ क्वेश्चन पूछ सकता हूँ? तो सर बोलते हैं ये ऑफकोर्स श्योर, क्यों नहीं। हाउ लॉन्ग हैव यू बीन इन दिस पोजीशन, आप इस पोजीशन में कितने ईयर्स हैं? तो आप वो बोलता है कि तीन साल से हो, 3 years। एंड हैव यू कंसिडर, आपने कंसिडर किया है टेकिंग अ स्टेप टू द नेक्स्ट लेवल, and have you considered taking a step to the next level? of course, तो आप चाहते हैं कि आपने ये ऐसे सोचा है कि आप जो है नेक्स्ट लेवल तक जाएं, आपको सोचना बोला, क्यों नहीं। डू यू माइंड शेयरिंग व्हाट डू यू थिंक इज होल्डिंग यू बैक, आप समझ सकते हैं, आप जानते हैं कि आपके साथ सबसे बड़ा इम्पोर्टेंस क्या हो जाता है। एक तो कहावत भी चलता था कि पेन जो चलाने जानता है, पहले एक कहावत प्रचलित था, कलम की पावर जो है ना कितनों को, तो यहाँ पर कलम की पावर है कि पेन की ही पावर है। जब किसी को फांसी दिया जाता है तो एक सिग्नेचर इम्पोर्टेंट रहता है, एक सिग्नेचर, और उस कलम के बाद नींव भी तोड़ दिया जाता है, तो इतना इम्पोर्टेंस है पेन का। इस टाइप से बोल करके उसे कन्विंस करना और प्रोडक्ट बेचना, यही तो स्ट्रेटजी है ना। उसके बाद
in order to sell the product, because they're expecting you to be able to already understand the basics of their product from their website and from the job description. However, sometimes you may have companies with more complicated products that just want to see your best attempt at getting a good solid sale through with the limited knowledge that you have. Don't try to let your limited knowledge affect your ability to give a confident and clear sale. You're not expected to understand the product in full depth, so if you give a misunderstanding about what exactly the product is, that is fine. It's not the end of the world. It shows that you probably didn't do your research, or maybe it might be information that wasn't on the website at all. It's okay if you make stuff up at this point. You're not being tested on how well you know the product. You're being tested on how well you can make a sale. So go with it. So naturally, this will vary tremendously depending on the type of product that you sell, depending on the type of company that you're working with. And our example here utilizes Great Learning's product. So we're talking about selling courses and selling certifications. Now, in such an example, we are going to want to, again, move towards a soft sales approach, a solution-driven approach, and in this particular case, again, B2C approach. But in this case, we're moving at a very different point from the kind of monologue-oriented discussion that we had when we were talking about the Sell Me This Pen point. Instead, we're going to run through a question-answer process. So let's start with the first question. Of course, sir, could I ask you a few questions first? This is a polite thing to do generally, where you are signposting your customer that I'm going to be asking you a few questions. They say, sure. So we begin with the first question. Now, the first question is always one where you try to create an opening, or you try to create some sort of understanding of what it is that the customer's need is. So if we're talking about career growth, the first thing we ask is, how long has it been since your last career growth? So we ask, how long have you been in this position? Say the response is 3 years. And have you considered taking a step to the next level? Well, most people would answer yes to this question. Now, he's been in the position for 3 years, so we can say, okay, you're right to move to the next position now. You've been with the company for 3 years. Let's move to the next position. So you can talk about that extent in a positive way. Alternatively, you can move in a slightly more negative approach and move towards a bit more of a hard approach by asking something along the lines of, do you mind sharing what you think is holding you back? Now, this is essentially the gist of why hard sales is so effective. That last line here, what is holding you back? Now, the benefit of hard sales, and a lot of people say that hard sales is sleazy. A lot of people say that hard sales is not genuine, that it requires you to lie or cheat your way to the customer. That's not necessarily the sense. That's not necessarily the case. You can have a hard sell, which does involve lying and cheating, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. A hard sale is essentially a process by which you latch onto something and tell the customer, let's go now. The pressure here is built on the concept of urgency rather than on the concept of lying or cheating or moving ahead without perfect information. It's just a matter of the fact that explaining perfect information isn't something that's necessarily beneficial if you're trying to make the decision as simple and binary as possible. You just explain the information that is relevant to the customer at the moment. So talking about things like the details of the course and stuff like that in the curriculum is irrelevant to someone who's only going into the course for a promotion. For them, it doesn't really matter what the curriculum content is. It doesn't matter what they're learning. What matters is that they'll get the certification at the end, have the skills to move forward, and be able to employ in that kind of position. So if you're moving toward the hard sales approach, that is going to happen. It's bound to. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're doing so from a place of deception or malice. That's something that you don't want to have in your head. Hard sales can definitely still be used in a positive way and leave the customer feel positive by the end of it, but it does need to utilize a fear of either inadequacy, that without this product, you're missing something, or a fear of missing out. That if I don't buy this product now, I'm going to lose out in the long run. I'm not going to be able to get a similar thing further down the line. And you want to take advantage of either of these 2 points if you're doing a hard sell. So in this case, do you mind sharing what you think is holding you back? In which case, they might discuss something along the lines of not being able to move forward in this position, politics, or because of other people who are in the front of the line for managerial positions. At which point, we might consider them to change fields or something like that. The hard seller would then pressure them in order to do so that we could move towards a different position. Why waste more time in a position like this when you know you're not going to be able to use it for growth? When you know you're not going to be able to get a higher level position? Let's move now. The sooner the better. Let's jump. So those are some of the differences between the sell me this questions. And that's something that you probably want to pay the most attention to in terms of ensuring that you're able to impress the interviewer. However, there's another question type which can sometimes be just as memorable and just as engaging, which is the tell me about question. Now here, there's a lot of points that we need to keep in mind. Now, the first thing that we need to understand is that this is a request for a story. The person on the other hand is trying to ask you to share a story with them. When they're asking about a time that you did this, or a time that you did that, a time when you struggled, a time when you engaged with the customer, they're looking for a story. They're looking for something that you've done which moves from a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, there's a few points to note about this story. The first is make it entertaining. Try to add, if there's one best place to add humor to an interview discussion, this is it. This is the time when you really want to make it as entertaining as possible and make it as engaging and interactive as possible. Number two, avoid rambling, but don't be afraid to continue in a different direction. Now, what I mean by rambling is when you ramble, it's essentially talking about a point off on a tangent that has nothing to do with the primary. Now, in this case, rambling in a bad way would be using the story to talk about the hierarchy in your previous position, or who your manager was, or giving us information about them, or anything along those lines that isn't related to you and your professional growth. It could be anything, for example, personal that's unrelated to your career, or it could be anything related to other people in your previous companies, or the companies themselves outside of your presence and role in them. So those are irrelevant. Those are considered rambling. But if you're continuing in a different direction, for example, if someone has asked you about one story, and you can mention how that story taught you a lesson, you can talk about the lesson in a little bit more depth. We'll give an example of this when I use the example cases. But if you're able to use the story as a way to either talk about one of your strengths, or talk about a skill that you learned, or a tool that you started to use, take advantage of that. Talk about it. Which brings to the next point, which is use this as an opportunity to showcase your talents. Not just in the things that you learned from the time itself, but also the tools that you use in the story during it.
अब यहाँ पर बात आ जाती है कि टेल मी अबाउट, तो आपके बारे में बताओ हमें। यहाँ पर थिंक आपके दिमाग में बहुत से थॉट्स आने वाले, दिस इज रिक्वेस्ट फॉर अ स्टोरी। तो यहीं पर अगर बताया तो कुछ आप स्टोरी टाइप में कुछ बताएं, मेकिंग इट इंटरटेनिंग, और जो कि इंटरटेनिंग जैसा इंटरटेन करे, माहौल इंटरटेनमेंट पर बना दे। वाइड रैम्बलिंग जैसे कुछ ज़्यादा नहीं कि अपना एटीट्यूड उसमें दिखाना, उस टाइप का नहीं। अपने आप को शो ऑफ नहीं कर रखना, बट डोंट बी अफ्रेड टू कंटिन्यू इन डिफरेंट डायरेक्शन, और कहीं अपने पीस से बाहर नहीं चले जाना है। जो कंटिन्यू है, जो नीड है वहाँ तक ही रहें, और स्टोरी से बाहर एक स्पेसिफिक स्टोरी बनाई जाए जो कि आप सुनाएं तो उसे इंटरटेनिंग भी हो और उसको कंफर्ट भी उससे मिले। ये नहीं कि आप उससे कुछ उसको बोले और बकवास लगे, जिससे कि मूड ऑफ यूज दिस एन अपॉर्चुनिटी टू शोकेस योर टैलेंट। और यही एक अपॉर्चुनिटी होता है जिसमें कि आप उसे बता सकते हैं, दिखा सकते हैं आपका हिडन टैलेंट क्या है, वो टैलेंट आप क्या डिजर्व करते हैं।
So let's take a look at some common questions here. Number one is, tell me about your most successful sale. This is a question that tends to get asked regularly of salespeople and sometimes BD individuals as well, as a way to sort of showcase the highest point in your career so far. So let's answer this one. So far, my biggest sale involved arranging a 5-year contract between my previous company, an agricultural exporter, and Aldi, a massive supermarket chain in England. I had tried to reach them via email for almost a month before, just to try it, I posted a photo of our orange farm on Facebook and tagged them. Within a week, we were in communication, and it took only several more months before the documents were finalized and the deal was made. It goes to show the value of out-of-the-box thinking. So what is this story telling us? Well, the first thing it is it's saying that this particular person, that I, in this case, am not the kind of person who gives up very easily. So if I've sent emails to this client, to this customer, I'm going to do so, and I'm going to still try other options and channels. Not everyone is like this. If you don't reach out to a customer in one way, some people give up. Some people that don't have the kind of discipline and diligence to keep trying will give up. But number one, it shows that I didn't. I tried a different method. I tried a bunch of different methods, and randomly one of them worked. Right, tagging them on a social media page. The next thing it says about me is that I'm resourceful. I do try out-of-the-box concepts, and I am able to benefit from the rewards of those out-of-the-box concepts. Number three, it says that I'm comfortable handling large sales with massive contracts with huge amounts of money on the line. This is particularly relevant and particularly important if you're moving into a BD role, that you are able to understand and comprehend massive sales on a large extent. Next, tell me about your most difficult customer. This is something that a lot of telesales and a lot of phone sales companies will ask, because it is something that allows them to understand how you deal with customers that may bother or irritate or even potentially even yell at you. So, tell me about your most difficult customer. During the second year of my career in telesales, I spoke with an older gentleman who was completely convinced that our institution was fake. I'm again talking about great learning here. Despite all the standard objection handling techniques I had been taught, he was still insistent. I showed him our website, our Google reviews. Nothing convinced him until I finally sent him a WhatsApp video showing the campus. Some people might have given up, but I guess I was too.
यार यहाँ पर भी सबसे पहले यहाँ पर जो है ना, आप अगर जाते हो और इंटरव्यू देने, तो कहानीकार अगर हो, अच्छा सी कहानी बना लेते हो और टाइम टू टाइम और उसके मूड को देख करके आपकी कहानी दिमाग में आ जाते हैं, तो आप सबसे अच्छा और सीट ले सकते हो। सो फार कुछ दिन पहले की बात है, माई बिगेस्ट सेल इन्वॉल्व अरेंजिंग 5-year कॉन्ट्रैक्ट बिटवीन माई प्रीवियस कंपनी। जो पहले कंपनी था वहाँ पर जो है सेल्स इन्वॉल्व अरेंजिंग 5-year कॉन्ट्रैक्ट बिटवीन माई प्रीवियस कंपनी। तो यहाँ पर सो फार कुछ दिन पहले की बताऊँ, मैं भी कैसे इन्वॉल्व अरेंजिंग 5-year कॉन्ट्रैक्ट बिटवीन माई प्रीवियस कंपनी। मेरी कंपनी के साथ जो है ना 5 year का कॉन्ट्रैक्ट था। वहीं पर ऐसा घटना देखने को मिला इन एग्रीकल्चर एक्सपोर्टर एंड हल्दी मेसी सुपर मार्केट चेन इन इंग्लैंड। जो हल्दी नाम का है मेसी सुपर मार्केट है, बड़ा सुपर मार्केट है, चेन है इंग्लैंड में। आई हैड ट्राई टू रीच आउट, मैं वहाँ पर जाने की कोशिश आया बाई ईमेल के थ्रू वहाँ पर जाने की कोशिश किया और उसे मिले क्या फॉर ऑलमोस्ट अ मंथ। पूरा मंथ बिफोर मैंने प्रैक्टिस ट्राई किया, जस्ट टू ट्राई इट। मैंने पूरा मंथ ट्राई किया। आई पोस्टेड अ फोटो ऑफ आवर ऑरेंज फार्म ऑन फेसबुक। मैंने जो है ना ऑरेंज फार्म का फेसबुक पर फ़ोटो अपलोड किया और टैग किया उनको। विदिन अ वीक, कुछ दिन के बाद, एक सप्ताह से पहले वी वर इन कम्युनिकेशन और हम लोगों ने कम्युनिकेट एंड इट टुक ओनली सेवरल मोर मंथ्स और before the documents were finalized and the deal was made goes to show the value of out of the box thinking। तो जिसके कारण जो है वो उनका ध्यान मेरे ऊपर आया और मैंने उन लोगों के साथ डॉक्यूमेंट साइन किया, जिसके कारण जो है एक बहुत हेल्पिंग हुआ। और इसमें जो है ना हमारे स्पॉन्सर किया, इस टाइप से बोल सकते हैं। तो ये एक थिंकिंग था कि कैसे मैंने सक्सेसफुल हुआ, जिसको मैं जानता भी नहीं था और बाहर में था, वो दूसरे कंट्री में था। मैंने उसको कैसे अपनी ओर आकर्षित किया और अपना काम निकलवाया ऐसा। तो ये बात तो भाई मार्केटिंग वाले के लिए, तो ये मार्केटिंग वाले का बहुत स्किल मजबूत होता है यार। मैं ये बोल करके चलता हूँ, क्योंकि उसको कितना भी कुछ बोलो, वो ये सब बंदे अगर रियल में अगर वो वर्क फील्ड में आते हैं तो धमाल मचाते हैं भाई। क्योंकि उसको बहुत सा नेगेटिविटी सब का सामना करना सिर्फ नो 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 योर मोस्ट डिफ़िकल्ट कस्टमर। तो यहाँ पर जो नहीं अब यही आई है ड्यूरिंग द सेकेंड ईयर ऑफ माई करियर इन टेली सेल्स। जो है सेकेंड ईयर के करियर में मैं टेली सेल्स में काम कर स्पोकन विद एन ऑल्डर जेंटलमैन। और मैं किसी ऑल्डर बुजुर्ग आदमी से बात कर रहा था। वो आज कम्प्लीटली आवर इंस्टीट्यूट वाज फेक। और वो जो है कम्प्लीटली हो इंश्योर था, उसका पूरा विश्वास था कि मेरा इंस्टीट्यूट जो है फेक है। डिस्पाइट ऑल द स्टैंडर्ड ऑब्जेक्शन हैंडलिंग टेक्निक आई हैव बीन टॉट। और हमें जो है ना सभी तरह के क्राइटेरिया और ऐसे सब सिचुएशन को डील करने के लिए हमें परिपूर्ण और हमें सिखाया गया था। ही वाज स्टिल इंसिस्ट और वो हमेशा जो उससे सभी जो है इंसिस्टेड। आई शोड हिम आवर वेबसाइट। मैंने अपना वेबसाइट दिया और गूगल रिव्यूज़ भी दिखाए, लेकिन फिर भी नथिंग कन्विंस हिम। और वो तब फिर भी कन्विंस नहीं है अनटिल आई फाइनली सेंड हिम अ व्हाट्सएप वीडियो। और फिर उसके बाद मैंने व्हाट्सएप वीडियो से बात किया, शोइंग द कैंपस और कैंपस को दिखाया। सब पीपल माइट हैव गिवन अप। और कुछ लोग जो है इसे छोड़ दिए होंगे, बट आई गेस आई वाज टू स्टूबर्न। तो मैंने भी ये सोच लिया कि जब तक ये मान नहीं जाता तब तक इस पर ट्राई करते रहना चाहिए। लास्ट में उसने कन्विंस हुआ और मेरे को इस दौरान ये भी पता चला कि मैं कितना जिद्दी हूँ।
I was too stubborn.
जिद्दी होना भी
So again,
चाहिए।
this story showcases the resourcefulness of the person who is looking for this job and the ability to just be stubborn and diligent in moving towards that sale and not taking I give up and not being able to just push a customer away just because they have an objection and ignoring that kind of pushback. So this is a case of, in both of these situations, showing resourcefulness and hardiness in terms of never giving up and constantly trying and moving ahead with sales. And these are both skills that are extremely useful in any sales or BD environment. So try to think about a few stories in which you were able to show your own ability to never give up and your own ability to be resourceful and think outside the box. The next question we have is a hypothetical one. How would you handle? Now, this specific question type generally orients itself around giving you a demo scenario and asking you to take care of that scenario, asking you to understand how you handle it. It's a question of judgment and decision making and is oriented around the idea of asking you questions of how you would come to a conclusion based on a problematic scenario. It's usually a question that gets asked of managerial positions, though not always necessarily so. If you're in the type of position where you're often going to make decisions without your manager present, then questions like this may come to you as well. Now, in answering these questions, it's important to consider what your company's values are and the kind of corporate culture that is exposed by that company. If the company is more of a traditionalist kind of purview, then it might be important to handle situations by speaking to a senior leader and by escalating these situations. However, if your company is more of a Western organization, is a bit flatter, is a bit more widespread, oftentimes they will require you to come to conclusions on your own and give in-depth decisions about what you think should be done for that kind of circumstance. So it's important that you understand how hierarchical or how wide that particular company is as a way of knowing whether or not I'll ask my manager is a valid answer to these questions. Now, another answer that can have a varied amount of response is the it depends answer. Now, you never, ever, ever want to just say it depends on its own and not give any context to that, because that says absolutely nothing about your decision-making process. It doesn't answer the question. What you can do, however, is say it depends and then follow up by talking about what it depends on. Now, you could say, well, it depends on whether it's like situation A or situation B. In this case, I would do this. In that case, I would do that. We'll again talk a little bit about how to use the it depends answer right when we go into the example. So let's take a look at them now. So, number one, how would you handle a mistake that you made that cost an important deal? So how would you then follow up by talking about what it
तो यहाँ पर स्टार्ट करेगा जब अगर वो हाउ वुड यू हैंडल, तो आप कैसे हैंडल करोगे थिंग्स टू कीप इन माइंड। और आप मन में क्या सोच रहे हो उस टाइम के बाद। दिस इज ए क्वेश्चन ऑफ जजमेंट एंड डिसीजन मेकिंग। और ये क्वेश्चन जो है ना आपका ये स्किल्स और जजमेंट स्किल्स को यहाँ पर पता करता है कि आप जजमेंट कैसे करते हो, हैंडल कैसे करते हो। यूजुअली बट नॉट एज वेल ऑलवेज ए क्वेश्चन फॉर मैनेजरियल पोजीशन। और ये जो है ना ज़्यादातर ये जो क्वेश्चन जो है ये नहीं हो सकता है कि ये मैनेजर पोजीशन के लिए हो। कुछ भी पूछा जा सकता है, कंडीशन क्रिएट किया जा सकता है आपके लिए। कंसीडर द कंपनी वैल्यू एंड कल्चर। और यहाँ पर कंसीडर कंपनी वैल्यू और कल्चर के बारे में ये डिस्कस कर सकते हैं। वाइल इट डिपेंड्स इज अ वैलिड आंसर, फॉलो द पॉसिबल वेरिएबल्स एंड डिसीजन। कुछ ऐसे एग्जांपल्स आप दो जिससे कि वो कन्विंस हो जाए। नो आगे हम चलते हैं, कौन कौन सा ऐसा आप दे सकते हो एग्जांपल जिसके कारण वो कन्विंस्ड हो जाए।
It depends on. Now you could say, well, it depends on whether it's like situation A or situation B. In this case, I would do this. In that case, I would do that. We'll again talk a little bit about how to use the it depends answer right when we go into the example. So let's take a look at them now. So, number one, how would you handle a mistake that you made that cost an important deal? So how would you handle making a loss for the company? If you made a mistake that cost us money, that cost us a deal, and that caused the company to go into loss. Next. Well, I think it's important to take responsibility for your own actions. So I would definitely try to fix the situation. Because that's the first response. We're trying to fix it. We're trying to sort it out. But that may not necessarily always work. So that could often be a follow-up question. So let's reiterate. Let's talk about that. Let's say if it works, what do we do? If it doesn't work, what do we do? So if an apology is possible, I would definitely try to clear things up as quickly as possible. I would rectify any misinformation that might have been given and clarify our position. I would try to restart negotiations once the situation has been fixed. Depending on the seriousness of the issue and the response of the customer, I might arrange some special offers if the company allows, since a discounted deal is better than no deal at all. So what are we saying? Well, I would try to salvage the situation. I would try to solve through the problem as best as I could in order to get to a position where I was still able to make the deal. It may not be a perfect deal, it may not be what was originally intended, but a deal is better than no deal, most of the time at least. Unless you're working in losses, any deal is generally better than no deal. Next, how would you handle a difficult colleague? Well, it largely depends on if the issue is a skill issue or a will issue. So again, here we're looking at the it depends answer. In fact, here we're using the words it depends directly. So it depends on if it's a skill issue or a will issue of handling a difficult colleague. This is generally seen from a senior or managerial point of view. So I'm always more than happy to take an unskilled colleague under my wing, the same way my previous mentor did for me, and I think it's good to continue that kindness. I'm usually less friendly towards will issues and will ensure to document the situation and escalate as per the company's policy if they become a problem. So what are we saying here? Well, we're saying yes, if it's a skill issue, I want to bring them under my wing. We're talking about upskilling colleagues, and we're talking about a kind of kindness and desire to do good, which is always a good thing. Here again, we're talking about kindness as a way of strengthening our own profile in terms of how the interview sees us. They see us now as someone who's willing, eager to be able to care for and bring up and educate our colleagues and to cater to their needs as well. However, another thing to consider is the last bit, when we talk about people who have will issues and how that changes the circumstance, and how we would flag it up and speak to someone in a senior position about that circumstance. This is important. You never want to consider that you are making these decisions from a position of total authority. You're not going to have total authority in the company, so you want to ensure that your answers reflect that. Don't just say, I would fire him, or I would, look at these circumstances, and if he failed, I would fire him. Because you're not necessarily going to be in that position to do it, at least not without heavy approval from other departments or from someone in a more senior position than you. So it's important that you do clarify not to utilize terms or not to discuss concepts that would be considered jumping the gun, that would be considered speaking with too much authority or autonomy than you actually would have in the company with the position that you'd be picking up.
तो यहाँ पर मिस्टेक दैट कॉस्ट एन इम्पॉर्टेंट डील. यहाँ पर अगर कोई मिस्टेक दैट कॉस्ट एन इम्पॉर्टेंट डील, ये भाई सबसे बड़ा पॉइंट है. अगर मैं मेडिकल फील्ड की बात कर रहा हूँ, अगर थोड़ा सा एक मूवी भी आया था कोई करके, मैं भूल रहा हूँ, एक मूवी था जिसमें कि थोड़ा सा नाम नहीं याद आ रहा है. चलो एक कहानी तो है, वो भी बताऊँगा आगे. और फिर उसके बाद मिस्टेक दैट कॉस्ट एन इम्पॉर्टेंट डील्स. यहाँ पर जो है ना, अगर कोई मिस्टेक हो जाए तो उसके अगर आई थिंक इट्स इम्पोर्टेंट टू टेक ए रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी फॉर योर ओन एक्शंस. अगर आपने कोई एक्शन लिया, अगर उसके साथ कुछ हो जाता है रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी, तो आपका रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी लेना आपके लिए अच्छा होता है. और जब तक आप रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी नहीं लेते हो तो रिस्पॉन्सिबल पर्सन कैसे बनो. सो आई वुड डेफिनेटली ट्राई टू फिक्स द सोल्यूशन सिचुएशन. और मैं ट्राई करूँगा कि उस सिचुएशन को हैंडल कर सकूँ और फिक्स कर सकूँ. इफ़ एन एपोलॉजी इज पॉसिबल, अगर एपोलॉजी अगर होगा तो मैं अपना माफ़ी भी मांगूंगा. तो आई वुड डेफिनेटली ट्राई टू क्लियर थिंग्स आउट क्विकली एज पॉसिबल. और जितना उसके उतना पॉसिबल करूँगा कि जल्दी वो क्लियर हो जाए और सॉल्व आउट हो जाए. आई वुड रेक्टिफाई मैनी मिस इन्फॉर्मेशन that might have been given and clarify our position. जिससे कि हमारे पोजीशन और पर कोई आँच ना आए, उस टाइप से अपना देखते हुए आई वुड ट्राई टू restart a negotiation once the situation has been fixed. अगर फिर नेगोशिएशन और बात करने की भी करूँगा अगर सॉल्व आउट हो जाता है प्रॉब्लम, डिपेंडिंग ऑन द सीरियसनेस. उस टाइम के सीरियसनेस को देखते हुए द इशू रिस्पॉन्स ऑफ द कस्टमर, और उस टाइम के इशू और सीरियसनेस को देखते हुए कस्टमर को डील करूँगा. आई माइट अरेंज सम स्पेशल ऑफर. मैं कुछ ऐसे ऑफर दूंगा उसको जो कंपनी अलाउज, और कंपनी अलाउज करे सिंस डिसकंटिन्यूटेड डील इज बेटर देन द डील एट ऑल. और डिसकंटिन्यूटेड डील से जो अच्छा है कि बेटर डील मिले. अ डिफ़िकल्ट कलीग कुछ है largely depend on the issue, स्किल इशू और विल इशू. यहाँ सबसे बड़ी अगर बात करें तो सबसे बड़ा स्किल और इशू और विल इशू सबसे बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट रखता है. ऑलवेज मोर देन हैप्पी टू टेक एन अनस्किल्ड कलीग. इसमें जो को कोई अनस्किल्ड कलीग को लेने का अंडर माई विंग, जिसके स्किल से ज़्यादा हो, उससे अच्छा है कि मैं अनस्किल्ड कलीग्स को लेना पसंद करूँगा. द सेम वे माई प्रीवियस मेंटर डिड फॉर मी एंड आई थिंक सो गुड टू कंटिन्यू द काइंडनेस. और उसने अपने काइंडनेस को दिखाया. दैट्स I'm usually less friendly towards Billy issue and would ensure to document the situation and escalate that for the company policy if that become a problem. यहाँ पर सबसे बड़ी बात है कि अगर स्किल्ड स्किल इशू और फिल इशू यहाँ पर अगर नॉन स्किल्ड ज़्यादा स्किल है, मैं ये चाहूँगा कि कोई भी अनस्किल्ड हो, अनस्किल्ड पुलिस हो तो वो सबसे अच्छा है, क्योंकि वो सीखने पर गौर देगा, वो अपने मेरे को और मतलब अवॉइड नहीं करेगा, अपने से ज़्यादा नहीं समझेगा। और ये भी सही होता है, ज़्यादा स्किल वाले होते हैं तो वो अलग से दिमाग लगाता है, जिससे कि अपना भी माइंड डिवेट होता है। सबसे पहले ये कहानी की बात कर रहा हूँ तो ये अभी जो है ना बजाज सीमेंट वाला सिस्टम है, तो जिससे कि किसी का घर गरीब आदमी का गिर गया था, वहाँ पर इंजीनियर जो है अपना दिमाग लगा रहा है और वहाँ पर जो है कोई उसको सुनने वाला नहीं। तो अगर मैं वहाँ पर कोई भी एंगल उंगल सब वहाँ पर नहीं समझता है कि किस टाइप से पिलर बनाया या नहीं बनाया, ये सब कहानी में एक समझाना चाहता हूँ। और यहाँ पर सबसे पहले हो सकता है कि ये बात की न्यूज़ जाने से पहले जो है ना पूरे ये कंपनी पर एक छाप छोड़ देता है कि अगर बाई चांस अगर टूट जाता है तो फिर अगर कोई भी कंपनी अगर कोई सीमेंट था वो भी याद नहीं है, उस सीमेंट को खरीदने से पहले एक बार सोचेगा ज़रूर कि भाई यहाँ पर ऐसा एक कंडीशन हो चुका था। तो उस हिसाब से जो है ना मतलब ऐसा अगर कंडीशन होता है तो उस टाइप की को हो सके तो वहीं पर सॉर्ट आउट करें और न्यूज़ तक ये सब बातें ना आए, अगर आप चाहते हैं। और नहीं तो आप अपने अगर रियली में आप में डिफेक्ट है तो फिर आपको उस पर काम करना चाहिए। अगर नहीं है तो आपको नहीं है तो भी आपको जो है ना मतलब सॉर्ट आउट करना चाहिए, चाहे उसको ऑफ़र दो या कुछ भी दो, उसको सॉर्ट आउट कर देना चाहिए। क्योंकि एक बार अगर किसी बंदे पर अगर नेगेटिव इम्पैक्ट आपके कंपनी का अगर चढ़ गया तो उसको उतारने में बहुत टाइम लग जाता है, मे बी कभी भी ना उतरता है। क्योंकि यहाँ पर हर एक बंदा और जो भी होता है आपके नेगेटिविटी को ज़्यादा कंसिडर करता है, पॉजिटिविटी को कुछ नहीं देखता।
Speaking with too much authority or autonomy than you actually would have in the company with the position that you'd be picking up. Next, we have the why did you leave question. This is always a staple of a lot of interviews. So they will ask you why you left your previous company. So what do we keep in mind? Well, as I said in our previous session, people do not appreciate you bad-mouthing your previous employers. Reason for this is simply that if you bad-mouth your previous employers, then when you're done with your job with this company, they know that you're more than likely to bad-mouth them to the next company after that. They don't want that kind of reputation. They don't want that in their company. They don't want the kinds of bad reviews that lots of companies get on places like Glassdoor and such that will leave negative perspectives for companies. And oftentimes these negative reviews means that those companies will not get high-level staff without paying them significantly higher than their competitors do. So this is something that a lot of HR teams particularly care a lot about. Next, avoid gossip at all costs. You don't want to burn bridges. So not just about the companies, but don't talk ill about other people that you've interacted with either. Who knows when that connection might be useful for you in the future? Do not burn bridges. Do not talk about people behind their backs in this way. Not in an interview. You're trying to put your best self across, and a gossiper is not your best self. Next, be truthful, but downplay any kind of emotional or political conflict that may have happened. You want to ensure that you do say something in an honest way. If you have a gap, be honest about that as well. But ensure that you are able to justify your position in such a way that any kind of emotional or political conflict is handled in an effective way and handled in a professional way that doesn't engage in too much, for lack of a better word, gossip or emotional posturing. So let's look at an example. The company decided to change their incentive policy, and I didn't feel the new policy was a good fit for me. I enjoy putting a lot of work into going above and beyond, but I think it's important that my company also appreciates.
तो वाई डिड यू लीव, अगर ऐसा अगर क्वेश्चन है कि आप अगर प्रीवियस कंपनी को आपने क्यों छोड़ दिया, मस्ट पीपल डू नॉट अप्रिशिएट बैड माउथिंग प्रीवियस एम्प्लॉयर्स। तो कुछ ऐसे जो हैं बहुत से पीपल हैं जो कि बुराई तो कर सकते हैं, लेकिन जो है जो अगर आपने अच्छा काम किया है तो उसको अप्रिशिएट नहीं करते। अवॉइड गॉसिप एट ऑल कॉस्ट, डू नॉट बर्न ब्राइडेट्स, बी ट्रूथफुल। और मैं यहाँ पर ट्रूथफुल हूँ, मैं क्या किसी के गोसिप में नहीं पड़ने वाला। और पॉलिटिकल करियर से मैं दूर रहता हूँ। डाउन इमोशनल और पॉलिटिकल कॉन्फ्लिक्ट से हम पास नहीं जाती। धर्म से मैं विश्वास नहीं रखता। द कंपनी डिसाइडेड टू चेंज देयर इंटेंसिव पॉलिसी एंड आई डिडंट फील द न्यू पॉलिसी वाज अ गुड फिट फॉर मी. I enjoy putting a lot of work into going above and beyond, but I think it's important that my company also appreciate me for doing so. तो कुछ ऐसे चेंजेस आए थे कंपनी में जिसके कारण मैंने वो सूटेबल नहीं था, मैं उस कंडीशन को फुलफिल नहीं कर सकता। तो और उस कंडीशन और आप में कंपेयर किया तो आपके क्राइटेरिया और कंडीशन में मैं एक्वायर कर रहा हूँ, उस हिसाब से मैं फील कर रहा हूँ आपका एनवायरनमेंट हमें सही लगा वहाँ का इन्वायरमेंट थोड़ा सा मतलब वो अनटॉलरेट बोलते बोलते हाँ, इसलिए मैंने उसको लीव कर दिया उस कंपनी को ना। उसके बाद आगे चलते हैं।
Appreciates me for doing so. Instead of bad-mouthing the company by saying they used to offer so much for incentive, but now they just offer peanuts, and I'm not happy with that. That's why I'm looking for another company. What you're saying is that they moved their policy procedure. They changed the way that they do things. I'm not making a judgment call of how it's good or bad, but I know it was not the right fit for me, at least. For my desire, I want a company that is willing to really reward me for all my hard work and reward me for actually making sales for the company. So I need a company. I personally need a company with a good incentive policy. So that's something that you can say, and the interviewer may often agree with you. Yeah, that's something that we'll definitely provide. You're going to be a good fit for our company. Now, you want to ensure that this is something that the new company doesn't share. If you're not happy with a corporate culture, for example, you want to make sure that you are able to clarify that this new company that you're coming into, you are interested in sticking with, and that you have done your research on their company culture, on this new company's culture, and you know that it's going to be a right fit for you, at least based on the limited research that you've done. So it's important that if you do bring this point up, it should not be a point that the new employer shares with the old one.